Okay, welcome back. Now I want to talk about Islamic art. And then once we're done with that, we'll talk about how Islam became so influential in the world. Okay, time permitting anyway, we'll see how it goes. It's always hard to tell with these videos, and I thought I clicked that. Come on, go. Okay, so like I said, in a lot of Islamic cultures, there has been a tradition against making images, with some going as far as to say, don't make images at all in any context. So how do you respond to something like that? Because people love beautiful things, people want to live in beautiful places. Well, a new style of art develops that is not based around images of any particular thing, but more around geometric patterns and beauty in a more abstract sense. But I think, as you'll see, these things can be still very, very beautiful. So take a look at this. This is what we call an arabesque design. And I'm going to move this over here so you can see a little bit more. Yeah, look at the way we use different patterns here. And this sort of pentagon geometry and these diamonds here. Yeah, the use of color and patterns is a big mark of Islamic art. And this kind of design is called an arabesque. So arabesques have to do with these sort of complicated lines and these deliberate uses of patterns. And these adorn a lot of Islamic buildings like mosques. And so just because you don't have images of particular things doesn't mean you can't have beauty. And as you might imagine, the name arabesque comes from, something that is like the work of the Arabs. And that's what these are. The Arab influenced cultures that are Islamic cultures build off of these designs. But another big factor is the use of writing. So if you look all around here and I think here and here as well, you see that there's a use of, beautiful writing, which is literally what calligraphy means. Calligraphy is actually a Greek word, but it means beautiful writing. And so various cultures have done forms of beautiful writing throughout history. And Islam, it's taken to to a whole new art form, because the sort of patterns of Arabic lend themselves very easily to these kinds of designs, to these sort of beautiful kinds of cursive and whatnot. In fact, in some parts of the Muslim world, it's a tradition to see what you can do by sort of blending image and writing. And so you have this pair which has Muslim prayer for protection. Is very cool. And so you can do things like that, but you can also just use the writing itself as a way to create additional beauty through the beauty of the script. And that can be very handy as well when you're doing designs without specific images being depicted. But like I said, there are some parts of the world where it's actually okay to do images in Islam if you're doing it in more of a secular context. It might even be okay to depict Muhammad in a secular context as a historical figure. As actually some historical images of Muhammad from a fellow named Rashid al-Din. Rashid al-Din was writing a history of the world. He wasn't writing a religious text. So his illustrations fit with that idea of doing things in a secular context. So he depicts Muhammad because, of course, he's a very important historical figure. So yeah, like I said, it varies around different parts of the world. But you continue to have the beauty of writing throughout. In terms of architecture, Muslim architecture, one of the most important things is the use of the minaret. So the minaret is basically just a tower, but it sort of takes on a distinct form. Pardon me. And it seems like almost every mosque has one. And why would you want a tower for your mosque? Oh, I should mention, of course, that the mosque is the Muslim building equivalent to a church or a synagogue, the building for religious activity. And so the reason you'd want a tower is because, you're in a Muslim town, your religious leaders would want to call everybody for the 5 daily prayers. So the muezzin or the mullah will get up at the top of the tower and cry out in a very loud voice. Voice is so important in Islam. Will cry out that it's time for the daily prayers, and will in fact maybe cry out a prayer to sort of project it throughout the whole town. And nowadays, when the towns are so much bigger, they actually have loudspeakers on these towers. So they project through the whole city. Wherever you go, you're going to hear the sound of the prayers. And so that's definitely going to bring people together. And maybe if someone was feeling like, oh, maybe I won't do my prayers today, they're going to hear the prayers and they're going to have a reason, everybody will be getting together at the mosque, or at least at their own home. They will be able to hear these prayers. So the minaret, very important thing in Islamic architecture. Okay, so I want to talk about how Islam spread through the world. So after Muhammad died, like I said, it was a political organization as well as a religious organization. And that political organization is known as the Caliphate. So the Caliph is the political and religious leader of Islam. Ooh, pardon me if I sneeze here. Nope. So the successor to Muhammad basically is the Caliph. And you actually have a few different caliphates throughout history. The first is kind of continuing on from Muhammad's footsteps from his work, and that's the Umayyad Caliphate. And the interesting thing about the Umayyad Caliphate is it conquers a major part of the world. It conquers basically all of North Africa here. It conquers Egypt, and it heads west to conquer areas like Morocco and Tunisia and Libya as well. Definitely still controls the Arabian Peninsula and controls a big part of what we would term Persia, but is today known as Iran, and Mesopotamia, which is today known as Iraq. So this whole part of the world becomes conquered by the Umayyad Caliphate. That's a pretty significant thing. And the Roman Empire used to control this territory, but then some outside tribes like the Vandals took it over from them, and then the Caliphate took it over from the Vandals. So this is the part of the world that we tend to think of as the Middle East. The Middle East is a kind of a weird concept, but maybe if we look at this map, we can figure out a little bit more of where that idea comes from, because it doesn't entirely make sense. For instance, Africa is often thought of as the middle part of the Middle East, or especially North Africa. Places like Egypt are, but it's not really, east of Greece and Rome. It's, parts of Africa are west of Greece and Rome and south of Greece and Rome. So that's weird. And then, why the Middle East? Well, it's because the Near East is thought of as this part over here, but eventually, in these days, we just say the Middle East for all of it. So why do we think of all of this as one sort of conceptual unit? Well, I think in large part it's because it is the Islamic part of the world. That is what seems to be most important. And during the Roman Empire, North Africa was thought of as part of the Roman part of the world. But when it's run by a different group of people, or when the leaders are a different group of people anyway, and you have a different religion, I think the reason why we see it as a different part of the world has a lot to do with religion. This remains, this part of Europe over here remains a Christian part of the world, and is seen, especially in the Middle Ages, as opposed to the Muslim part of the world. So in a way, we're kind of reenacting the Middle Ages when we think about these things. But there's one exception, which is Spain. Spain, under the Umayyads, was part of the Muslim world. It's not until later on that the Catholic Christians kick out all the Muslims, and also, I should mention, the Jews. And so Spain becomes thought of as a Catholic part of the world. But it's kind of unique in being influenced so strongly by Muslim culture. But like Africa is right over there, so it's not hard to see how that happened. And something I should mention is that we tend to think of Jews and Muslims as being in conflict. That is totally not going on in this era. That is an artifact of the modern day. That is something that happened really only in the last 50 to 100 years, which I know it seems like a long time, but we're talking about, centuries and centuries ago here. For centuries and centuries, Muslims and Jews got along really well. In fact, the people who Muslims get along the most well with tend to be other people of the book. People of the book, like Jews and Christians, what we would call Abrahamic, they are seen as being very close to Islam. And so they are not persecuted. They are taxed a little bit. That's what the idea the caliphate comes up with, is put a little tax down and say, so that way they'll have an incentive to become Muslims, but they don't have to. They'll just save money on their taxes. Yeah, that seems to work pretty well. And through a lot of parts of the world and a lot of times and places, Muslims and Jews have gotten along really well, and Muslims and Christians too, in the Holy Land especially. It's not until the Crusades that Muslims and Christians really come into conflict. And in this part of the world, in parts north of Greece, what we call the Balkans, Jews, Christians, and Muslims were all living peacefully together and respecting each other a lot. So honestly, the modern stuff is very recent in the grand scheme of things and has a lot more to do with political struggles after World War II. So something to keep in mind. It's kind of a common misconception that these clashes go back centuries. They really don't. Christians and Jews and Muslims have gotten along historically very well. And then after the Umayyad Caliphate, we have the Abbasid Caliphate, which eventually loses Spain but still controls Africa and this part over here, the East. And the East, the area of Iraq and Iran, is actually going to be very important to Islam as well. There are two main branches of Islam. You might have heard of these before. They are the Sunni and the Shia branches of Islam, Shia or Shiite. The Sunni could be described as a kind of traditionalist school in some ways, or at least more dominant. Maybe you don't believe they're right, but they're more dominant worldwide. And the big distinction has to do with the succession, with whether the caliphs after Muhammad were the right caliphs. So the caliphs after Muhammad, the Sunni believed that they were righteously guided. They were the right caliphs. From Abu Bakr onward, a guy named Abu Bakr onward. But the Sunni also include a guy named Ali as righteously guided. But for the Shia, Ali was the right choice. Ali should have been there instead of Abu Bakr. And so that's the big distinction. And you might wonder why it matters. It matters mostly just because these two groups of Muslims have had historically different cultures, been in different parts of the world, and have been allowed to develop different traditions around everything, different beliefs, different hadith, different schools of thought. And so the Shia are kind of wanting Ali to be more recognized and believe that the descendants of Ali, who are known as imams, are the real caliphs and have a certain kind of spiritual authority that more mainstream Sunni Islam does not respect and does not understand. So, like I said, the Sunni are the majority at about 80 to 90%. 10 to 20% of Muslims are the Shia. And the Shia are mostly in Iraq and Iran. So I'll show you a map here. So the green parts are more Sunni dominated. So a lot of Africa and some places in Asia have Sunni Islam. But Shia Islam is important in Iraq and Iran, in Persia and Mesopotamia, you could say. And so that's why we hear about them so much. Or we did. I don't know if we're still talking about that as much today, but Iraq and Iran were connected with American conflicts. So Shia Islam was an important topic. And Shia Islam is, of course, very important to the people who practice it. I also want to mention the religious movement of the Sufis. So Sufis is kind of a Western choice of word. There's not like a clear boundary, but there's a sort of tradition of mysticism in Islam, of going and connecting with God through your own meditation and prayer, or in small groups that's not connected to sort of the mainstream caliphs as much, not necessarily opposed by the caliphs or by the law, but more individual oriented and more sort of focused on each person's relationship to God. I kind of feel like Sufis are a lot like hippies. Every time I see the Sufis saying something, it seems like very similar to kind of Christian influenced hippies or just hippies in general. They're all about sort of going and finding your own truth and your own experience. And they seem to get along really well with that part of Western religion. You might have heard of whirling dervishes. These are special Sufi dancers who dance out of the love of God and spin in these great circles. It's pretty impressive. And they're all about connecting directly with God. And in some ways, they talk about God as a lover. There's a poet known as Rumi who wrote these wonderful poems of his love for God and how he loves God and God loves him and his friends. He sees God in his friends and he sees God in his whole world. And God is described as the beloved. And he can use things like the idea of being drunk on God or riding a donkey and the donkey is God. He has some wild concepts, but that's his idea of God. Okay, I think we'll do one more video just to